Hello, welcome to The Exhausted Programmer. My name is Alexander, and today we're taking a look at an introduction to full stack development. This video is actually the first of a series of videos where we're going to look at the full stack development of a very simple app, a to-do app. In fact, in this video, we'll have a whole stack built up, but going forward in the next few videos, we're just going to improve on the different layers of the app and looking at maybe some of the options and decisions that can be made while going through this process. I have mentioned in other videos that the ultimate goal of this app is to go even beyond this series and to be actually used for personal use, where I can make my own internal ticketing system to make it easier for me to do bigger projects going forward for this channel. And I want to point out that any decisions that we make today as far as what software we use, what processes we use to handle different aspects can change in the future. There's no one solution to these problems. Even with the single app, we could do it multiple ways. This video series isn't about trying to figure out the best way, but just trying to get into the idea of full stack development for people who may just be a little confused as to exactly what that all means. First, we need to discuss what is full stack. The simplest explanation usually given is there's this concept that a software system has a front end and a back end. I am going to say that I usually think of it in 3 layers: front, back, and then this middle layer that I think of as the processing layer. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. But in truth, once you start having software systems being built, there could be multiple layers, or less than multiple layers, to be honest. Sometimes a piece of software is just SQL queries, and I would say all that is just basically back end. So I wouldn't get too hung up on what is front end, what is back end, because there's a lot of gray areas and there's room for a lot more layers into that stack. And so again, I'm going to stick with the front end processing layer and back end idea, but that's just because it's usually how I think of things, and it's usually how we're probably going to go forward for both this series and future series. Another key part of this series, by the way, is that we're going to be looking at how we can add requirements from, let's say, a project manager or some sort of stakeholder, and how we can meet those requirements with as few steps as possible. The idea of providing a minimum viable product or a quick return based on specs are key aspects of modern software development. And so we're going to be setting that up in this system to work that way, to better mimic what you might get in the real world. I do want to point out one of the things that we probably aren't going to hit on much is this idea of technical dead ends. I have seen software that was developed with a great, robust, future-proofing plan only to be used for one aspect and then being completely replaced by a whole new series, meaning that the people spent a lot of time working on a whole system that was never used. And it makes maintaining that system harder because you have to know more just to handle the one thing. I happen to know where we're going with this, and so it might be a little unfair to make this too much of a real world example because we won't hit any of those dead ends. But you know, you can't predict everything that you're going to see in the real world, and hopefully you can excuse me for not also covering that possible problem. So let's start with the requirement. We want a to-do list that is visible on any device in my home. An easy way of dealing with that is just making it web-based, because every device these days that has a screen has a web browser. And so if you can see it in a web browser, you can see it on any device. Also, to remove complications like data replication or just trying to transmit it, we're going to keep the data in one place. That's how our backend is going to be handled. We're going to have our backend, at least for this first video, just being a single file. And then we're going to have the web browser be our front end, and we're going to use HTML to set that up. And then we're going to have a processing layer to help the data get from the file to something that looks nice for the front end. I am running this now in a tmux session, so hopefully that this bar at the bottom will prevent the YouTube player from making it hard to read the bottom line. If this isn't enough, please let me know in the comments. I'll see what else I can do to make it even more of a buffer at the bottom. Also, a personal thing I always try to do when doing projects is never try to do everything, if you're doing some sort of web-based thing, on the same computer. One of the things I hit early on in my self-educational learning is you run these tutorials and they're like, oh, you know, run this code and run this code, and you have something that runs on your machine, but you can't access it from any other machine. And getting over those hurdles is actually pretty simple, but it's something I would suggest anyone doing, whether it's Apache like we're doing here, which is pretty straightforward, or more importantly, anything like node-based. Way too many node-based projects don't even hit the first layer of being internet ready because you can't even connect them from one computer to another. It's just a little pet peeve of mine, but something that is easy to fix if you just set that as your goal. And also, the last piece of meta information is that I didn't have as much time to make this video as I normally do, or as much as I thought I would have. So I didn't have a chance to get everything smoothed out. So there's going to be a lot of just pre-typed stuff when the video starts because I didn't have a chance to script everything. And I do not really like hearing the keyboard in the video constantly. And I also don't like showing off how bad it is typing. There is a mic right in front of my face, so I can't actually have the same range of freedom, and so I make more typos. Hopefully these little changes aren't going to be too distracting. So first, let's go to another computer. This is my Ubuntu on Windows using the Windows subsystem for Linux, but I want to go to a full-on computer where I have access to everything. I have Linux Mint installed on a computer somewhere, and this is where we're going to be doing our work. The first step is to make sure your system is completely up to date using the app update upgrade instructions. And then I had to install Apache 2. I don't know if that's true for Ubuntu and Debian, but it is true for Linux Mint. So I'm kind of assuming it's true for those two. But as simple as running this command and going through it all, I've already done that. And in doing so, you get some files set up and you get things ready to go. If we go to /var/3ws, HTML, and then in here, there is an index.html. We can go into it. I will be using Vim as my text editor, but feel free to use Nano if you don't know Vim. Nano is easy to use within a minute. Vim's easy to use within about 5 minutes, and I would suggest Vim in the long run, but if you're just looking to set up a website, maybe learning Vim is just not something you want to also do. In here, there's a lot of information. I'm going to go ahead and turn syntax off so that the colors don't kick in at some point. And, you know, CSS, information to set the colors and all that kind of stuff. And here we have the body and all the text, which, we could read, but it's not really worth reading here. Instead, let's take a look at it in the browser. To see what was in that file, we can go to that same IP address, and if we append the port number that we want, which is 80, then we can see the same information but presented in a nice visual manner. Again, we could go back to the index file and see that this table here is represented right there. And sorry for the flashes of colors if that bothers you. We won't do that too much more, but all this information is in that file, and this is how we would access that file going forward. The thing is Apache can support more than one website off of one server, and we can look about that maybe in the future. But part of the handling of the distribution of where the traffic goes to is handled in config files. One such config file is here. Again, syntax off. Where we see where the logging will happen, the server admin, the document root. We might want to change those in the future. And the document root right now is var whatever. We're going to change that when we create a new directory. But this is how it knows to go to this folder, and then it'll check the index.html file just as part of the default behavior of Apache. Also, the port number is defined here. Looking at this config file is how I knew what port number to go to. I could have looked at it documentation as well, but I've done Apache in the past, and I can't always remember every single port number, but I knew I would find the port number here. So we could just work with that HTML directory and change the index to be what we want to see on the website, but let's try to do a little bit better job of that and create our own directory. If we do lsla here, we see everything is owned by root, and that is why to create a to-do directory, this is why I put everything in copy and paste, is we have to do this as the sudo or as root user. And if we do that, then we'll see that we have the to-do. We can go into it and it's empty. And we are going to need to have an index file here. Let's go ahead and do that. And let's put our to-do list in here. So let's say we need to do laundry, we need to exercise, and we need to cook dinner. This will be our to-do list that we'll use for this video. Save and quit. Oh, it doesn't like that because I didn't come in here as the sudo user. So I can just sudo vim index.html, not the sudo user, but as the root user through sudo. Let's just go ahead and put it all back in and cook. There we go. Now we have this. And now let's see if we can get it on the web browser. So if we go into our etc Apache 2 directory and show what we have here, we have sites enabled and sites available. Let's go into the sites available, because here is where you set up your site to run on your Apache server and with its settings. Easiest thing to do here is just to copy what already exists and give it our name. And again, we have to do this as root. And it's not prompting me for my password because I did provide it, and it just has it in memory for a little bit of time. I do not want to think I'm advising people to run as a root user or without password protection. I just want to make that clear. We can go in here and again, syntax off. Here, again, it's going to look to put it on this port number. We could change this if we wanted to, but we do need to change the document root because our index file exists in a different directory. And again, with the right permissions, we can change this to do, because that's the directory. And again, it'll go there and look at the index.html. We could change some of this other stuff, but we don't need to at this point. And you think it might work right now, but just because the site is available doesn't mean it is enabled. In order to make it enabled, though, there's a very simple little tool that we can use for that is provided for us. Apache 2 enable site. That's what all those letters mean. And then we just tell it which config file we want to do. And then it even tells us what we need to run after this. The documentation I saw said to run this using the service command, but it seems to do basically the same thing, but depending on how the operating system is set up. So just do what it tells you to do and run it as sudo. If you don't, it's going to prompt you for some information to try to get the sudo permissions, but you can just do it this way and it's pretty easy. The other problem though that we might have is that we actually have two sites looking at the same port, but we can make this simple on ourselves by doing the Apache 2 disable site. So dis site, and then we can just disable this one. And then again, we have to run the systemctl thing, and now it should work. So let's take a look at the web browser. And here it is. And when we go to refresh it, there's our to-do list. It doesn't look good yet, but at least we have the data somewhere. That's the back end, and we have the front end, which is this web page. So now let's focus on that third layer, the middle layer, the processing layer. Also, I wanted to point out that our index file is in no way written to be in HTML. It was just a text document if we look at it real quick. So one of the great things about HTML, I think, or at least the whole web browser, is you can get text on a web browser without even knowing a thing about HTML. Of course, they put it all on one line and we'd want it as a list. So it's not perfect, but it is just shows you how easily you can get something up and running with how little information. You don't even need to know HTML to have a website running. But we do want it to look nicer than that, so let's figure out ways of doing that. First thing we're going to do is, first thing I'm going to do is to move my index into, I don't know, just a to-do list. And everything needs to be as sudo. I might be compelled to just change my user to root, but again, I wouldn't suggest doing that for security reasons. And let's create a little processing layer. I'm also working on an awk series, so when you have a hammer, everything looks like an L. Let's solve this problem with awk. By the way, awk will be one of the first things to be replaced in this stack. But let's create a process script in awk. And the good thing about awk in this situation and the way it matches with HTML is that you can have a beginning block, and I will turn syntax highlighting off again, just for readability. And then everything in these curly braces will run first. And then everything in these curly braces will run for each line. And then after everything has been processed, it will run this block as well. I'm going to fill these in real quick, but it's pretty straightforward. So all we're going to do is basically print out, we're using HTML. This is the header. It's got a title, close the header. The body starts. We're going to have an unorganized list. I think it's what the UL stands for. And then it's going to read in a line and it's going to wrap it around with a list item and then close the list item. Then we're going to close the unorganized list, close the body, and then close the HTML. If you want to go super minimal, there's a lot of HTML tags that you don't really have to close, but I like the balance. The spaces are just so that it's readable. If you just want to look at the HTML once we're done, which we will look at. But so I went ahead and put in the spaces. Maybe I should put in more spaces so that the body was more indented or whatever, but this is a very small file. I'm not too concerned about it. So let's take a look at how this works. We can cat out our to-do list. We can pass it into awk, tell it we want to run it based on the process file. And then let's just go ahead and put this into the HTML. And again, probably gonna have to do this like that. I've never had to do the piping. I've never had to do this arrow with sudo. And since we're not running a process, I need to see what it wants me to do. So the solution is pretty simple. We're gonna cat out the to-do list into awk. We're gonna do the file, and then we're gonna pass it into this program called T. T just takes one input and puts it out to two outputs. This is very handy with logging. It usually has a -a flag to append to the log. When we run this, not only is it going to write to this file, but it's going to put it to the screen like that. And if we go ahead and look at what is in index, we see that it's the same thing. If for some reason you want to do this in your own use, but you don't want it to screen, if you do this on top of it, it does the same thing. It just doesn't put anything to the screen because it outputs it to null, but we still have the same index.html. And now we can go to our web browser and see what it looks like. There we go. We have a to-do list. We have the front end here in the web browser handled by Apache. We have the back end being a simple file that I labeled to do, which has our list, and we have our processing script, which is how we go from the back end file to the front end in a presentable way in the web browser. Now, again, today's video was just to set up a full stack back end, front end, and this thing that I'm pushing called a processing layer. We'll go forward. We're going to make the front end look better, the back end be more robust. Also, sometimes I also like to think of a full stack as being actually 5 layers, where there's a front end and processing layer into the back end, and then a processing layer and front end out of the back end. And we'll definitely be looking at how to put information into the data without having to go right now into the server and editing the file itself. If I wanted to update the to-do list, I would have to SSH to the server and change it to add, to delete, or whatever I want to do there. Also, in future videos, we'll look about tracking more information to make this app a little bit more robust. But again, by implementing a simple feature request and then doing whatever we can do as minimally as possible to get that feature request done. And over time, you'll see that this builds up into something that is usable, functional, and helpful as we go forward. If this topic interests you, I would suggest subscribing to this channel so you're made aware when the next part of this series comes out. If you liked what you saw, like the video. If you have questions or comments, feel free to drop them below. I do respond to comments right now. There's not that many coming through that I can't try to respond to the ones that need responding to, but if I don't respond, I definitely read your comments. Some of them I just don't know what to say. I don't always know how to respond to compliments. Criticisms, though, I tend to respond. As I've mentioned previously, the tmux at the bottom is there because someone put in a complaint. And again, I'm not saying that in a negative way. I like these complaints. And I just straight up was like, all right, well then here's some options on how to solve it. And they actually gave me the third option. So because they did that, I just want to point them out specifically. Xshuna. I meant to do that when I brought up the whole tmux session in the first place. But yeah, so drop complaints if you want to, but be aware I might ask you on how you think it's best to solve them. So if you have ideas, you might want to just drop them in the complaints while you're making the complaint. But yeah, do that. Compliments are also welcome. Notes, ideas. I've gotten ideas from people on what to do. I don't always know exactly what people mean when they say the things they mean, but I do the research, I figure it out, and I have come up with ideas to make. And so, yeah, so please, the comments more than anything have been the most helpful. Share it with your friends, and thank you for watching.